Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
Hello and welcome to a very special episode we're recording today. We have particularly have a timely and significant discussion ahead as we delve into the unfolding events in Syria and their implications for the region. In the past few weeks, we have witnessed a dramatic shift in Syria's landscape. The rapid takeover by Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham (HTS) has not only displaced Assad's control but also raised critical questions about the future of Syria. With the involvement of various factions, including Hezbollah, Kurdish groups, and others, Syria has once again become a focal point for regional dynamics. What does this mean for Arab nationalism, the role of HTS, and the future of the Syrian people? To help us navigate these complexities, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Joel Parker, a distinguished researcher at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies at Tel Aviv University, who specializes looking at the Syrian region. So thank you so much, Dr. Parker, for taking your time and speaking to us today.
Thank you for having me. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. So before we move on to the specifics of what happened in Syria in the last couple of weeks, I just thought of if you could give a brief overview. That it seems that the Assad regime had regained control over much of Syria in the last couple of years at least. So what happened in the last maybe year or so that there was such a rapid takeover? If you could tell us a little bit about the situation before, because the situation was bad before, but somehow it seemed that Assad had it under control.
Thanks. Well, the thing is, it wasn't as under control as outside observers thought, I think, which is one of the key issues here. The biggest problem that Syria has faced under the regime-controlled areas of Syria have faced over the last really 4 or 5 years has been economic decline. I think that's my opinion that really the biggest problem and the sort of Achilles heel of the Assad regime in the last few years was the economy. One of the problems is that the Assad regime maintained its control through a network of patronage. They were able to, hire public servants, whether they be teachers or police officers or members of the secret police, which we call in Arabic mukhabarat, which is actually a very extensive network of police officers and undercover officers who are involved in maintaining the regime. It's part of an authoritarian state that was similar to like what you have in East Germany before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the problem is you can sustain that if the government is paying everybody salaries, and those salaries can provide for a comfortable life. So what happened was, because of the decline of the Syrian lira starting in 2019, the Syrian lira devalued by around 80% or more over a very short amount of time. So suddenly, if you're getting paid in the currency of the Syrian government, your actual salary is just worth less. So they have to keep bumping up the salaries quickly to keep up with the change in the rate of the value of the currency. So that's one thing. But then on the other hand, actually things became objectively more expensive. So in addition to just you have to use more currency, you also have to pay actually more. So for instance, if I can't give you the exact numbers off the top of my head, but let's just say you have to pay 20,000 Syrian lira for a pizza. Okay, you want to buy a pizza for 20,000 Syrian lira, and that costs maybe like $5 in US dollars. So over the last 4 years, that same pizza started costing $10 or $15 in US dollars. And so the combination of the actual inflation of the prices of food and the decrease in value of money meant that like government employees suddenly were forced to turn to alternative methods to actually fill in the gaps. So I heard stories of soldiers, and this is where it becomes very important for security. Soldiers were actually getting paid. Well, let's just put it in real terms. One soldier I saw was interviewed on, I think it was the BBC, said that their monthly salary from the government only covered 3 days of food for their whole family. 3 days out of the month. So you're saying that your full salary, the father, who's generally speaking the breadwinner, is bringing home enough food for 3 days out of the 30. That's not enough. So they started turning to other means in terms of, like, for instance, selling drugs. The regime was actually producing drugs, and a lot of the people working for the regime turned to various means of the drug trade, various, whether they were selling it or distributing it, I don't know, but they were taking part in the drug trade in order to make ends meet. So that's one thing. I mean, once you're a soldier and you're maybe a good person, I'm not saying you're necessarily a bad person, and you're starting to turn to drugs or prostitution or other various alternative illicit means of work, it's not sustainable.
And you mentioned about the internal part of it, and if I could quickly ask you a little bit about the externalities that happen. A lot of the experts mentioned, and I wanted to ask you about the same, that the immediate cause happened for the downfall was because of what was happening with Hezbollah, one of the largest supporters of the regime that time. They couldn't provide enough fighters, and also the Russia-Ukraine war. Russia was busy in Ukraine. So do you think these are also the two of the reasons, the externalities, which led to the certain downfall?
Sure. So that's the interesting thing, is that in the external game we have, let's say, two triangles. One triangle is the Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah backing for the Syrian regime. So this triangle is, supporting the Syrian regime and propping it up militarily. In some cases, also economically. And again, I'm sorry, I'm coming back to the economic picture, but like Iran, for instance, Iran was exporting oil to Syria, and a lot of times Syria didn't have money to pay for that oil, so Iran was like giving oil away for free to Syria. So that's one thing. But Hezbollah was helping militarily, and in the sense, Hezbollah wasn't getting really supported from the Syrian state. Like, the Syrian state didn't have very much money to pay them. It was more the fact that Iran and Hezbollah are close partners. You would really say, like, Hezbollah might even be considered a proxy force of Iran. And Assad was facilitating that. He was helping Iran transfer weapons and money to Hezbollah. But other than that, Hezbollah wasn't getting very much directly from Assad. So Assad's just kind of like a pipe, an empty pipe. And so, an empty pipe is only useful to a certain extent. I mean, you really, and that's the triangle that's supporting the Assad regime. I mean, the Russians also, they've been weakened by now over 2.5 years of fighting in Ukraine, where they've lost, hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, I saw one figure put it that around 1 million men in Russia have been put out of service, whether they've been killed or permanently injured or permanently traumatized to the point where they're not functional in the economy. 1 million men in Russia have been basically put out of commission, and that's costing Russia every day, millions and millions of dollars to continue to fight their fight. And now Hezbollah, to focus specifically, Israel. So the other triangle I would say is the triangle that helped the rebels win and as far as they won, it's Israel, Turkey, and Qatar, which is kind of funny because Israel and Turkey and Qatar don't get along very well. At least Turkey and Qatar do, but Israel is at a very kind of low point in the relations with both Qatar and Turkey. In the past, it has had a pretty good relationship with Turkey, but it's never had a very positive relationship with Qatar. At most, maybe a neutral relationship at most. Generally bad. So ironically, even though Israel was not necessarily intending to help Turkey and Qatar, because Israel carried out so many airstrikes against Hezbollah and really basically defeated the leader of Hezbollah, whose name Hassan Nasrallah, who was the head of Hezbollah for really about 30 years, and one of the main figures in Middle Eastern politics, Israel just assassinated him back in October of this year. And so really that kind of weakened Hezbollah militarily. And in a sense, Turkey was arming the rebels and supporting the rebels. And Qatar was also helping to finance that from behind the scenes. We don't know all the ins and outs of exactly what Qatar was doing, but we know that they were funding some of the Turkish, weapons and helping. So really, Syria was undermined by Israel, Qatar, and Turkey, all for maybe different reasons. But in the sense, that was the triangle that came in against Assad, and it was just much more powerful, much stronger. The Qataris have money. They're not in a financial crisis. They just hosted the World Cup. The Qataris are doing very well financially, as far as I know. And Turkey is not doing so well financially, but Erdogan has a relatively strong military and is doing better. Turkey is doing better today than it was like 2 or 3 years ago. So that's where I think we see like Israel, Turkey, and Qatar were just had a much stronger basis to support the rebels as opposed to the Iran, Hezbollah, Russia triangle that was supporting Assad.
That's a very comprehensive picture that you have laid for us. And I want to come again a little bit to the internal part of what happened exactly in the last couple of weeks or so. Syria has seen the coexistence of numerous armed groups, especially after the Arab Springs from 2011. We have seen multiple even Kurdish factions and Islamist organizations operating. So could you tell us a little bit about how the Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham HTS emerged as a dominant force within this fragmented landscape, and to what extent it has allies or support from the other groups?
Well, HTS, which was initially started as Jabhat al-Nusra, which was it was tied to Al-Qaeda, and it was a branch of Al-Qaeda that was formed in Syria, but it was formed by local Syrians. In a sense, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, who's now really ostensibly the leader of Syria at the present moment, he was radicalized in the early 2000s and watching what was happening in Israel and Palestine, and decided to go fight against the U.S. invading forces in Iraq in the 2003 invasion. I'm not sure he had very sophisticated ideology at that time. He was a young guy, and he got involved in the fighting. He just wanted to be active, and he was arrested. He was captured by U.S. forces. He actually spent around 5 years in U.S. prisons, and then was released and went back to Syria to help kind of start this new organization. And he was actually briefly involved with the guy who founded ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. So really, Jabhat al-Nusra was a very extremist kind of organization. How did it succeed is a different question, and that's a very good question. I think that we've had over the years, we've seen money coming in probably mostly from individuals. So that's the interesting thing is when some of these very extreme jihadi groups received more money from individuals over the years than they did from governments. So while the Qatari government may have known who was giving money to which organization, outside observers or people without access to intelligence don't know who was really giving money to who, for the most part. But I do think that probably it was individuals. From what I've heard anecdotally from people who've talked to me from Syrians, they've said that, well, really, like a lot of times you didn't even know who was doing the donation. Somebody would call up from a Gulf state, like say Saudi Arabia or Qatar, and just be like, I'm bringing you money, and you're going to use it to buy weapons from this person. And they would just like work it out. And so these wealthy individuals would figure out how to get money to these groups, because they believed that the Assad regime was an atheist regime designed to oppress people, and they didn't want it that they really believed that having a more Muslim style government would be better for the majority of the Syrian population. Now, thankfully, in a way, because of the length of the duration of the 10-year period or 12-year period that's passed, some of these more extreme movements have realized, I think, just from time, like the time that's passed, they've realized that most Syrians don't want a radical Islamist government. Most Syrians, even very devout Muslims, don't actually want to be living in a theocracy where somebody tells them and women how to dress and makes them wear a hijab by force. They don't want morality police coming around with clubs beating people up. Most Syrians don't want that. Actually, most people in general don't want something like that. But I think that they've seen what happened in Iran with the Iranian Revolution, and they see that that's something that's too extreme for most Syrians. They would reject it. It would actually turn people against religion if they tried to do something like that. So in that sense, this Jabhat al-Nusra became HTS. It cut off ties with Al-Qaeda, and over time, I would say it became more moderate. Now, the question that a lot of analysts have is whether it became truly moderate or whether it's sort of a facade, fake moderation, like pretend moderation, that they've maybe moderated a little bit, but we're talking about minute amounts of moderation, whereas under the surface, there may be still very extreme ideas there. We don't know the answer to that question.
And one of the things that I wanted to ask you from this, since you're talking about HTS, I have a couple of questions that I wanted to ask about HTS, and not in particular, but a very broad sense that a lot of people commented after the Assad's potential downfall was that it signified a death of Arab nationalism in Syria, because a lot of people looked at HTS as a form of a purely Islamist movement, with no connection to national identity. But over the last few interviews that I've seen of Jalani, he maintains that tone of just having only a Syrian overview, like not going beyond that. Does that mostly look at this Islamist movement, some connections with having a national identity? Or do they still manage to have some ideological or operational ideological connections with the Al-Qaeda?
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question. I don't really know. Again, that's part of our unknown question, because ostensibly, from the external point of view, we see that Abu Muhammad al-Julani, who now goes by the name, Abu Muhammad al-Julani is actually his nom de guerre. It's his war name. He actually prefers now to go by his civilian name, which is his birth name, Ahmad al-Shara. So Ahmad al-Shara, he has ostensibly said that he fully embraces Syrian nationalism, that he believes first and foremost he's a Syrian. Clearly, Islam is important to him, and that actually Islam for him, I think, signifies the ties that Syria he hopes will have with Sunni. Important to stress the emphasis on Sunni Muslim countries, not necessarily. Although it will be interesting to see. I think we'll start seeing some of the tests when we see his relationship with Iran, being the most important Shia Muslim country, whether there's some kind of, the problem with Iran is that they were so involved in supporting the Assad regime that it's very unlikely that the new Syrian government will jump to embrace a warm relationship with Iran. We see now signs that Iran is actually trying to reach out to them, because Iran has a lot of investments still going on, still active in Syria, and I think they want to at least try and recoup some of that money. But going back to your question of whether Syrian nationalism is the real thing or not, I think that it helps. It helps us. I think that it's a tool for him, and I wouldn't downplay that. Nationalism is a very powerful tool that unites people, at least within a certain border. And right now, I think the main goal of Ahmad al-Shara is going to be to unite all Syrians together, including, by the way, the Kurdish population, which is right now, the most problematic group, mainly because they still have weapons. The other minorities have essentially voluntarily disarmed, or for the most part, it looks like they've disarmed, so that you have different minorities, for instance, Christians or Alawis or Druze, who, as far as we know, are not actively fighting against the government. Whereas the Kurds in the northeast of Syria, they have weapons, serious weapons, and mostly from the United States, and they could, mount a defense. Um, that being said, a lot of them do feel that they are Syrian nationals. So they themselves are divided on this issue of whether their Kurdish identity is the most important thing or whether their Syrian identity is the most important thing. And I think when the government in Damascus puts the emphasis on Syrian identity as including everybody who lives in the territory we call Syria, that includes the Kurds. And I think that that's a sort of call to peace and to say, hey, listen, guys, you can lay down your arms. Let's all be Syrian first of all, and then we can work out by negotiation if some group feels like they need more representation or more autonomy. That those sort of questions could be worked out through negotiation. But yes, nationalism in a sense is the most effective way to unite the people in the territory.
And going forward, since this is very early to say, but how do you see the HTS managing administrative functions in Syria? Do you see there is a potential of a democratic elections in the future, or what changes are the citizens expecting under their rule?
I think what we've seen so far from my observations, just in the very few days, we're talking about 2 weeks here, that the government has actually, there's even been a new leadership in Damascus, and 2 weeks is nothing in the big picture. I mean, you would really need like years and some maybe even like decades to actually like form very healthy, long-term, established, political parties and democratic institutions. I think that in terms of the responsiveness, you see rapid response to the population, and when people have complained about certain things, we've seen a very quick reaction from the new group in Damascus. I'll just give you one small example, which happened in the last couple of days. In fact, I think it might have even happened yesterday. There was a report yesterday that came out, videos emerged of some of the fighters who were connected with fighting the regime set a Christmas tree on fire in a city near Hama, which is central Syria. They set a giant public Christmas tree on fire, and it was deliberate, and it was very offensive to Christians who are celebrating right now their holiday on December 25th. And the fire was put out, and it was very distressful for the Christian population of this town. And the message was sent to Damascus that this was very, very a big problem, and the videos were put up on social media, and it was reported in international media. So today there were protests in Damascus, which is the capital of Syria. There were protests saying, oh, the Christians are upset that they're being oppressed, that they're not able to celebrate their holiday. It's all because of this new radical jihadi government. And what was the government's reaction? The government's reaction was, first of all, quite angry. They said that this was absolutely in no way patriotic Syrian behavior. These guys must be foreigners. There's no way real Syrians would do this kind of thing. This is an anti-Syrian type of act, and we don't tolerate it. And when we catch the people who did it, we will punish them. Secondly, that's one thing, which was fairly quick response and very respectful, and they really took the matter to heart. The second response was not only that, we're going to declare that from now on, every December 25th and 26th is a public federal holiday, or like national holiday, so that actually the government offices are going to be closed tomorrow and the next day, the 25th and 26th of December. And from now on, in fact, like every year, it's going to be declared that that this is Christmas is an officially recognized holiday by the state, and we're going to do that just to kind of respect this Christian minority, to make sure that nobody feels like they're being left out. And I think that the rapid response of this government was just one example of many I could give you of the government quickly moving to try and fix problems. And if you want to use a metaphor, put out fires. And so I think that's a good sign that the government is definitely responding to popular issues, or to things that come up. That does not necessarily mean that they will become a democracy tomorrow, but it is there's a kind of sense in which I think citizens feel like they have the ability to talk to somebody. If they need to talk to somebody, there are proper channels to talk to, and that the government has an open ear to their problems. So, these are, I think, key issues going forward.
Yeah. And one of the other issues that the international community has highlighted over the period of time and even spoken to in some of the interviews was how the women would be treated or the minorities would be treated. And one of the stark similarity was how what HTS is trying to achieve right now in Syria, uh, trying to legitimize themselves. Taliban did the same thing when they came in Afghanistan. But over the period of time, as we saw in Afghanistan, how women's rights were dashed. Uh, when this was asked to, for example, Jalani in one of the interviews, all he said was, "Those are tribal people. We are not." So, do you see a difference in how, for example, how the Taliban have governed or eventually led to those either the civilian rights or, for example, women rights? The same might happen in Syria, or you see a positive change?
Well, yeah, I think that there's a fear among Syrians, less so, I mean, foreign observers like myself and others, I think, are trying to give the government the benefit of the doubt with the kind of the hope, the wishful thinking that hopefully things won't be like in Afghanistan, because we know that for the last, maybe 100 years, Syria has had a different trajectory, and has been westernized to a large extent in the sense that you know Western cultural values have taken over the main cities like Damascus and Aleppo. Female fashion has gone with the trends for the most part. Um, but, that being said, I think the group that felt disenfranchised, the group that felt most um, discriminated against by the Assad regime was the majority, which is the Sunni Arab population. And the Sunni Arab population of Syria, especially the ones who are living more in the suburbs or the rural areas, tend to be fairly conservative. And so you tend to see more women who have the hijab and who dress modestly, and men who refrain from drinking alcohol and those sorts of things that are in line with Islamic traditions. So the question is whether this group of people, which is technically the majority of the Syrian population, will sort of dominate the political culture of the next few years. And that's an interesting question in and of itself. I think that we could see one of the predictions I've seen from analysts is that we could see from the ground up a kind of a popular Islamic values kind of situation where instead of the government enforcing it from the top down and saying, okay, everyone has to dress this way, we might see from the bottom up like a resurgence of popularity in conservative Islamic culture, which is something that you can't really stop, because if it's from the bottom up, there's nothing you can do about it unless the government tries to like stop it. So I think that this government won't stop that. If there's a popular movement that comes from the bottom up to spread Islamic values, I think that the government will encourage it. It probably won't do anything to stop it. But it will be a tricky question to see if the opposite happens. I mean, if I'm wrong and analysts are wrong, and somehow like maybe secular culture or westernized culture, like a very dominant Western secular type culture, were to emerge as the bottom up popular movement, what would the government do in that situation? Because the government might find itself suddenly out of step with these new trends. That's a scenario which we don't expect, but if it happens, it could create maybe some cultural tension between the government and the population. Now, of course, the third option, which is also which is likely as well, is that we could have two separate trends going on: one towards Islamicization and one towards secularization, which is like could be happening at the same time among different populations. In that sense, we don't know. In that sense, we could have internal tension between the more Islamic side of things and the more secular side of things. Um, But again, that's where coming back to your great question about the Syrian nationalism, I think that's where Syrian nationalism plays a role in kind of uniting both sides. People who are secular and people who are more religious would still probably embrace this patriotic, milieu, this patriotic middle ground. And that I think is another reason why, the government in Damascus is very, very keen to keep that going, to keep that patriotic feeling alive, because it's the most powerful thing they have right now to unite everybody.
The thing that you're mentioning about how there is a certain sense of easing up, and we see the HTS seeking legitimacy, obviously, from international community. And one of the things that we have seen in the last few days was the United States dropped its bounty on Jelani, signaling there is a potential shift in its stance. Is it too early to predict that the international community might have a shift in the entire posturing of what is going on in Syria? Because we saw, for example, the US had really sad relationship with the Assad regime. So do you see there is a certain indication that there is an evolving perception of HTS and its leader on the global stage?
Well, first of all, I think that yes, but one of the interesting things I just saw in the last few hours was that HTS is actually calling to disband itself. They're actually going to dissolve themselves, and the fighters for the HTS are going to join. Well, either if they want to, I guess, be civilians, they'll be civilians, but the ones who want to remain as part of the fighting force will be reformed into a national army, a new national army. So I think that's going to be an interesting thing. I also noted that Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, when he announced that they are going to drop the $10 million bounty on Abu Muhammad al-Julani's head. So that means that he's no longer going to be considered a wanted terrorist. And two, again, like if HTS no longer exists as an organization, there's not really much anyone can do. I mean, it's unless they know every individual fighter and can follow them as they become part of the new army, which I don't think they will. I think in this case, there's definitely a sense in which the West wants to move on from the past. The question would be really how things go. If the National Army turns out to be oppressive against minority groups, we could have a different situation, but let's just cross that bridge when we get to it. For now, I believe we're going to see. I mean, and Julani also said, like earlier, that he was going to dissolve the HTS, and I think now he's already taking steps to do that. So I believe that the trajectory is that all these organizations, some of which have been designated as terrorist organizations, are going to be dismantled and reformulated into a national army, along with other soldiers who are definitely not on terrorist lists. That's going to be, it could be a challenge for Syria to have an army that is filled with people who maybe used to be considered terrorists. But I think that like we have to really realize that most armies are comprised of people who are psychologically normal and a small percentage who are not. Every army has, I mean, I think it's like a statistic. Every army has like a certain percentage of basically people who join the army because they actually like the idea of killing other human beings. And it's usually a small percentage, but it's almost in almost every army. So in that sense, I'm not sure the Syrian army will be that much different than any other army in the world. And so you have to have structures and laws in place to prevent any kind of excessive, violence.
We're recording this from Israel, and this begs the question that for a lot of people who might be wondering that what does the recent or what are the recent events in Syria, how does it affect Israel's security and regional strategy, especially near the Golan Heights? Does it changes any posturing in the Israel's part?
Well, I mean, the Israeli government right now is cautious because they're worried about, there's two scenarios that I'm hearing from the Israeli establishment. One is the fear that this government in Damascus will fail and that there will be chaos and there will be a massive, renewal of strife of some sort, and you could have the reemergence of terrorist organizations, the actual like decentralization of power turning into a free-for-all, and in fact, including even the return of ISIS. And in that scenario, Israel is concerned that there should not be any weapons around, there should not be major, heavy machinery around. And Israel made a lot of huge effort to destroy almost the entire arsenal of the old Assad regime. And in the Golan Heights, in particular, the reason they expanded their control over the Golan Heights to include what was previously the demilitarized zone, as well as a little bit further than that, because they were trying to capture the high areas. They want to make sure they have all the high ground looking down into Syria, because the Golan Heights, as you can tell from the name, is high. So they want to capture the high ground so they can look down into Syria and see if there are any challenges coming at them from the ground. The strategy, so the second scenario, which is, I think, a little bit more tricky to know how it will end up, is actually a different kind of fear, if you want to call it a fear, is that this regime might actually succeed, and that they might actually create a new moderate Islamist government that would be, in some ways, not that different ideologically from Hamas. And that in itself is kind of a fear. Like, what happens if Syria becomes a successful country, but it becomes a country that essentially adopted an Islamist perspective that's not that different from this Hamas organization, which, as you know, attacked Israel on October 7th, 2023, and started a major war that Israel has basically continued since then. So I think that that's a concern that Israel, that we don't really know what will happen if that happens. In fact, for some analysts, that's the more likely scenario. We see that the trend is now towards centralization, towards building a new state. And what if that state becomes like a new Hamas, very anti-Israel, very angry, very, how can you say, with a focus on maybe attacking Israel. We don't know how that will turn out, but that's certainly a fear that is in the mind of some Israeli thinkers.
I'm probably asking one last thing, that
Mhm.
is it in Israel's interest to have a weak Syria, in the sense that when we see a certain consolidation right now in Syria, is that worse than what had been in an Assad regime when he didn't have control over the entire Syria and Israel could actually carry on the operations that it needed to?
Well, in a sense, yes. I mean, Israel's interest is that Syria would be strong enough to be internally stable, but weak enough to where it wouldn't be a threat externally. Um, and I think that's the simple, short answer to that question. I mean, I think it's Israel right now, at least until it understands where Syria's long-term interests are, and whether it will be obsessed with trying to defeat Israel, or whether Syria could become, perhaps even in the future, my hope is that it could even become a normalized, partner in peace. Because I think we have actually ways we can get along and gain from each other's, existence. But that, to me, that's a little bit far off in the future. For now, I would say you're correct that Israel would probably prefer a stable, weak, new Syrian government.
Well, that's all the questions that I had. So thank you so much, Dr. Paga, for taking the time and speaking to us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.